So, and let me just look at what Bill has here. I have investigated Marion's notion of givenness. Okay, so David and Bill, there's this discussion of the phenomenology of givenness, like in Marion, Steinbach's book on mysticism, and he has another book on the alien and life world. Okay, so let's consider these things, but let's also go into 4.5 and 4.6. Is there anyone who would like to point to a particular section anywhere in 4.5 that we can start with by looking at closely? Maybe we can take a second to look at Jeremy.
Sorry. Well, I just wonder if I could what is the view of the group on the following question? Does the current scientific discussion of ether bear any weight in respect to the philosophical discussion of ether? Or are they in, so to speak, separate magisteria?
Could you elaborate that thought a little bit more, particularly what your definition of both the philosophical and the scientific?
Right. I'll try. Part of my problem is I think it's not an easy question, and I may not be competent to satisfy anyone else, and I can't satisfy myself 100%. And I don't want to ramble. So to the best of being brief, whether or not you can move across, quote, emptiness and have physical consequence in that so-called action at a distance, took a big jump with the development of electromagnetism and the concept of a field. But the concept of a field to me remains obscure. The concept of a field seems to me is only known in the practice and in the rules of saying, look here, here's this magnetic core. Now I'm going to wind wire around it and I'm going to create electricity. The conversion from electricity to magnetism back and forth and the way it works has always seemed like a real mystery to me. And yet it's probably, quote, scientifically, close quote, in its basics, one of the best understood things there is. It's trivial physics 1. High school kids learn this stuff. Well, what is the deep philosophy they don't learn? Or has the math and the empiricism of proving out the incredibly accurate predictions kind of set to rest ontological concerns? And if not, why not? And I don't know the answer to that.
If I can bed what you're saying, as best as I understood it, which I may be not driving into what you're saying here, forgive me, but to bed this within the text, page 126, 4.4, I think that's where she starts to talk, Conrad-Martius, a little bit about this divide that you're noting. So I'll just read the quote. It starts 4.4, very start there. But the section starting with thus, so a couple sentences in.
126, sorry, 126.
Yeah. Page 126, okay. Very start of 4.4.
Got it.
Thus, in the question of the pre-physical levels of nature, which in both biology and, as we shall see, physics are not to be denied, the interpretation of the issue at hand has its recourse to mathematical symbolism. The same inherited viewpoint is clear in the issue of causality. The discrediting of causal thinking may have been necessary in order that aspects of the essence of physical nature be brought to light, your coil, right? But today the prejudice must be exposed. An abundance of new facts and phenomena force us to conceive new causal categories, which embrace both the ancient and the contemporary perspectives. Although it is fashionable from the perspective of microphysical studies to talk about acausal thinking, it is ontologically completely absurd. So I think it seems like she's digging into this idea that there is a divorce conceptually.
Well, she is. I agree with you. And if it's not here, it's on the next page. She astoundingly, and to me, not to her credit at all, denies the validity of Darwinian evolution through natural selection, which is something like silly. So, I mean, she does dig in, and it seems to me she goes off the rails. And because she's trying to just walk away from coercively objective reality in the name of some metaphysical principle that I can't find.
Can you, I'm sorry, rookie here, but could you locate that denial within the text?
I sure
just so
can.
We can dig into it a little bit?
It's 137. 137. Allah. Oh, come on. Yeah. Okay, 137 about. Okay, let's see. What? Oh, here I've got. Oh, I beg your pardon. I did not give you the right page number. I beg your pardon. It's 127. Sorry. There's something else on 137 I had written down and I got them confused. 127. Come on back. Oh, come on. Here we go. Okay. Where are we? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm about 60% down the page, and it's a sentence that begins toward the right-hand margin. Nor would the idea occur to explain morphological, typological operations by descendants theory, i.e., through random variants of physically conceived hereditary system. Now, that is exactly what Darwinian evolution is. And she says, similarly, one would never have been tempted, I'm reading up a little above the beginning, similarly, one would never have been tempted to explain the formation of organic forms through mere stimulus response processes, nor would the idea occur to explain morphological, typological operations by descendants theory. And I can't help but think, but what she means by descendants theory is the theory of evolution or selection or through natural selection. And she's saying, well, no smart person would do that.
So I think what she's doing is she's trying to show that these sciences need to be placed in a metaphysical context that is lacking. We need different new causal categories. And you know, we read Logical Investigations recently, and I feel like towards the end there of the Prolegomena, Husserl brings up these topics, and especially when he's talking about the relationship between mathematics and philosophy. But I think that, and I think this discussion in Husserl is really important for what we're talking about. But also, I think the real interesting thing to think about is Plato in the Republic. He has this part in that allegory of the line towards the end of book 6. He says, you know, we could proceed according to hypotheses. You know, I'm in my house. I can walk out the door. I walk out the door. It's true. I can walk out my door. You know, I proceed from like certain kinds of hypotheticals that don't seem like hypotheticals. They're like certainly true. They're not apodictically certain, but here I am, and then I can go somewhere. So that's like moving from, let's say, this point here laterally to this point here, and we think in this like surface world, whereas there, Plato says that we want to move to the anhypothetical, and in order to do that, we would have to perform this dialectic, and it would be like moving from a dianoetic thought to nous, to pure noesis, the kind of stuff that first philosophy, as Aristotle characterized it, is consists of, the kind of thing that the prime mover thinks. Now that's far out, right? That's like totally different than natural scientific thinking,
Right.
and the kind of like common sense everyday thought.
Okay,
that we have.
if I could interrupt you just there, because thank you for getting to exactly that point, because it seems to me that that same notion is lurking in Conrad-Martius, and I think what it is I'm trying not to be too editorial. I think what it is a deep belief that the world is incomprehensible without the existence of a prior intelligence.
Well, so the category
And that, now, may I finish that?
Yeah, of
please?
course.
A prior intelligence. For her, that prior intelligence is obviously God, and this is so real to her, so undeniable to her, that it works its way all through her thought, downstream, 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 and it becomes a genius's way of defending creationism.
Okay, I don't think though, she's defending Driesch. She's defending the notion of entelechy. Now that is a part of this, like, very reduced form of the debate, creationism versus natural selection. But moving aside from that, I mean, that's reading into it, and certainly, it's suggestive of that kind of thing. So
well, she says it right on 127.
See what she's saying there, when we look at it again, she's talking about descendants theory, Abstammungslehre. She has a whole book on this. She has multiple things that she writes about these topics, including in the excursuses in the early part of this section. She's talking about holism, performism, and entelechy, to call it by the label that we find on the first section. There's other categories as well. And the point is, it's not God. That's not the only category that she's bringing in. She just says other categories of causality.
I actually have a core question here. There's obviously a lot to this, and there are other things could be said. But I think Gordon is exactly right. I think this is a profoundly theistic viewpoint, maybe profoundly pantheistic, that purpose and intelligence and nous are the primary reality within which all else is. I think that screams out from every page.
Oh, of course, I don't deny it. I think absolutely, but I don't think it's like your typical thing. It's not your mama's theism, it's not the kind of debate that we have today, which is really totally different.
Agreed with that.
Yeah.
Agreed, but that doesn't make it more valid.
Not bad.
It just means she's a genius, and Dawkins and etc. are not.
No. See, I don't think she's denying that stuff. She's placing it. She's placing it. Max Shaler's title, The Human Place in the Cosmos, is bringing in these different metaphysical categories, using phenomenological method. This is another example of this placing, or positionality, as Plessner calls it, for instance. And you find this a lot in philosophical anthropology.
What do you mean by that? That's something I'm not totally familiar with. Could you say a little bit more? Positionality?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a world picture, right? Like we have this schematic that we got, right? This is one example of these categories, right? There's like the prime matter and stuff, right? These are like maybe ancient metaphysical categories, but those aren't the only ones. We can bring in all kinds of categories to give enough room for our framework, our scheme, our metaphysical speculative schema, in order to account for natural phenomena. And those categories that natural science uses, are some, right? And they're familiar, and we're comfortable with them, and we have a certain attitude towards them. But there's more that we could have. And it's not just natural science versus God. There's all these different categories. And you see this, especially in the literature on philosophical anthropology. There's different forms of life below, and there's different kinds of manifestations of spirit and soul in categories above. And that's just for consciousness or subjectivity. There's also this prote-hule, right? And then there's all these categories of dark matter that physics gives us that we don't understand. We live in the dark. We go from hypothesis to hypothesis, and there's light. There's different degrees of light, and depending on what kind of schema we entertain, not fully adopt. We don't have to drop everything and feel like we're giving up being rigorous, but we can adopt different schema to understand different philosophers and their systems.
Can I ask a question at that point? What are there any rules or conventions for the nature of evidence in respect to these transcendentals to which you're pointing? Or is it just people talking until other people get tired of listening or don't? Because you've invented these forms of light. Whoa, what forms of light? What do you mean by light? And what will your evidence be in such a case? It seems to me it's easy to talk this way, particularly if you're using acid. But short of that, what is the nature of evidence, or does evidence matter?
Well, I'm afraid I'm fresh out of acid, so I will try that. But okay. I want to get us tied back to the text to answer that question a little bit in a certain way. And I'm going to tie in a little bit of Husserl as well, since we've just talked about logical investigations. But to return to the phrase that you brought out there, Gordon, nor would the idea occur of explaining morphological typological operations. And I think that's specifically important, that she's looking at, or it's being talked about a specific operation of being, perhaps we could say, or it's a specific operation of us as thinking beings by descendants theory. So these operations cannot be fully encapsulated through descendants theory. I'm going to stick to that because that's the language she uses. I don't know.
What do you mean by full? What do you mean by fully?
What I'm seeing here in a certain way, I would see a criticism of taking the inverse, is that it would argue that our morphological typological operations, if they are based entirely in evolution, allow for a kind of potential relativism, which would be contrary to what Husserl talks about. Because we believe that by random accidents, it's entirely possible that these morphological assertions could be very different than what they are, which leads us to sort of a relativistic claim about our interrelationship to reality. And I think that it's good to critique that a little bit, because it can move us into a relativism toward the logic of typology. So I think that's what I'm seeing there as well. We don't have to necessarily go to, yes, God ordained the form of human beings to be in this certain way. I think we can take a step back and say, this is somewhat a defense of a more hard relativism. If we take evolution as kind of a broad, it can be relativism over time, if not carefully defined in category.
Okay, well, when you mean, sorry, Jeremy, your turn, go ahead.
No, I wanted to say.
Bill, sorry, yeah.
I think that Randy had hit it on the head, and we're missing the point, I think. If we go back to the text, it's the very first sentence of the paragraph that's important. And this is what she's talking about through that entire paragraph. is about the cause must be proportionate to the effect. And that's something people have been saying for eons. And so this is where it's so very important to understand what Randy was saying, because it goes back to Aristotle and the birth of our metaphysics. It has to do with categories. And so what is particularly an issue here for Conrad-Martius and for natural science today is the nature of ontological categories. And so I have debated with physicists for years about what the physical means, and nobody has the foggiest idea. But the point is that that's also a category, the physical. And so the point is, whenever you start looking for evidence, you've got to start with categories. You need them. You cannot proceed without categories. And so so Conrad-Martius is, in agreement with Gordon, is introducing other categories. She apparently has categories that are greater than our materialist physics. And she talks about spirit and things like that. And so she wants to know, how do these categories get mixed up with each other? How does one category cause another? And that's really the whole point that she's making there in that sentence that Gordon has pointed to, and in other sentences similar to it. We could say the same thing with the mind-body problem.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's essentially the category question.
I agree that this is very similar to the mind-body problem. Absolutely. And that we're, okay, fair enough. Yes, absolutely. Mind-body problem is implicated here in just the same way. And the question is, if we allow awareness or consciousness to be a mystery, which it seems to me right now we're obliged to do from just about any perspective, when do we rest when do we rest with our, pardon the expression, learned ignorance about a mystery? And if we insist on not allowing it to rest, at what kind of discourse should we reactivate ourselves to try to explain it? And it seems to me that some people want to go into realms of verbal abstraction, and other people want to insist on following the iron rule of empiricism and said, please talk to me after you've got data. If you have data, then I'm interested in what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're whistling in the dark.
Well, I think that.
Sorry, go
no,
ahead.
please.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think particularly here, I love that you use the term mystery, because of course that does allow us a brief turn, perhaps, to when do we talk about the rest, into the religious. Of course, if we look on the mysterion of the Eastern Orthodox Church, we recognize that language is used to talk about, I guess in the West we call it the sacrament, which is fundamentally trying to wrestle with the religious conception of the inbreaking of mystery into our practical lives, into our real world. I think that there might be an analogous thing that we can move towards there. But really,
Amen.
the point of this statement is to lift up mystery. Yeah.
I thank you very much for that. I agree completely.
Well, can I just, one thing Evan said a minute ago that I think, if I understand right, I think is a really good point, and it's precisely about that sentence that Gordon was focusing on, how apparently Conrad-Martius is at least denying the idea that random variance can explain the development of organisms over history. And I think what he was pointing to, I think, is a very good point. And it kind of represents maybe a way to come at what, Gordon, that you're concerned about, I think, because I think that it is possible to go from the bottom up, in a sense, by which I mean, and we see this in Husserl. Husserl discovers essential necessities about consciousness. And he claims to be doing that. For example, any example from phenomenology would do. The essential necessity of physical objects are only visible from perspectives. And it's just a step further to say, how is it that consciousness essentially is teleological? That's something he believes he can establish through direct evidence. And if that is true, now that could be debated too, but we have direct insight, he would say, because of our direct experience of the essential teleology of consciousness. The very essence of consciousness is to be oriented toward truth. That's what it is. And he claims we have essential insight into that. So therefore, what consciousness is determined by the truth.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I'm not finished.
Oh, sorry.
Part
Yeah.
B is we're embodied.
Yeah.
So how is it that the bodies that we're in work together with our conscious processes to disclose the truth? And I think Conrad-Martius, Husserl didn't get to this point, but Conrad-Martius, I think, would say is, if that's true, that our consciousness is embodied, our bodies must be fashioned in order to be able to do that, meaning there must be teleology and evolution. And I think that's what he's saying there. And at least that's a concrete reason someone could give. I don't think that's a mystification or an idle speculation. I think we can say, here's what consciousness is. Now you can dispute that too. But if you can at least say, here's what consciousness is, and it's embodied, what does that imply about bodies in the physical universe? I think that's a very concrete point. It's not just a mystical, weird thing.
Thank you. I think you're right. But to turn it from stating it beautifully as you did, where is the error in her? Where is the error in her thinking? It is precisely elevating consciousness to having, how did you put it? Aiming toward truth. And there's very good reason to think that what consciousness aims toward is winning an argument, because winning an argument is the only way that you get to the next generation. And our consciousness is embodied. It is brain dependent. And the nature of that brain work is savagely directed to reproduction.
And that's precisely the point that I would like to spend 3 hours.
There you go. There you go.
Why you're wrong about that.
Right, I know that. Now we're at where it is.
Yeah.
Now, fair enough. But I don't think we need hundreds of pages of German suffixing, of creating entity after entity after entity, and presuming their actuality, and then working with them, when it really comes down in many ways to just the conflict that you've established exists between what you think is going on and what I think is going on.
Well, and I think that's very interesting. And I guess I just want to make a distinction. Husserl has hundreds and hundreds of, you don't have to read all of it, just ideas 1 and ideas 2. And Husserl is focusing on what can be experienced, and working with what can be directly experienced. He claims to establish, I think he does establish, that consciousness is teleological. And I'm not done. But then part B is metaphysical speculation. And Conrad-Martius goes way beyond that. And I guess I really see, maybe you don't see this, but I guess I want to say that I really see a big difference between what Husserl is doing and what Conrad-Martius is doing. I'm not convinced that Conrad-Martius is on drugs, But I really think there's a difference between what Husserl does in terms of he provides a kind of evidence. He does really provide a kind of direct evidence that can at least be talked about and evaluated. And so yeah, I guess I just wanted to say, I think there's a difference there. And I also share, subjectively, I share your discomfort and your queasiness with this multiplication of metaphysical categories. I'm not denying it. I'm not sure what I think of it. But Husserl too had that same, or had a similar queasiness with the multiplication of categories and speculations, such as we find in people like Conrad-Martius. That doesn't mean she was wrong. So I guess I would want to, I feel that anyone who really studied Husserl should see what I mean, but that's kind of arrogant to say that. But I hope, but that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Yeah, just a sideline observation as we discuss this. I am noticing a sort of analogous contour to this conversation to the one in the many in a certain way. We have sort of an entelechy and a truth and a unity going on mixed with a sort of combativeness. I'm reminded of sort of Parmenides and Heraclitus discussing the nature of reality in a certain way. And I'm just noticing an analogy within our conversation. That's kind of all. I kind of just want to leave it there as a curiosity as we move on to whatever.
Well, I wanted to add something. And again, this is a very rough understanding what Conrad-Martius is about, and definitely different from Husserl, as Jeremy says. So I was going to bring this up because I brought it up. We brought it up in conversation with Gordon about the mind-body problem. But there's I was writing a number of papers a number of years ago about mind-body problem, and there's disputes amongst all different kinds of people and different understandings of mind-body, et cetera, et cetera. But the one thing that struck me was an interview with John Searle. And basically, and John Searle, as you probably know, is not a friend necessarily to many mind-body problem people, but he nevertheless is a physicalist. And so what he would say is that all the people that are trying to understand the mind-body problem is he just said, whatever it is, the brain does it. That's it. And we haven't understand how all the ways the brain does it, but it does it. And how it does it, it doesn't. It made me realize that what he's really saying is, and I've said this to other physicists, that physics doesn't explain anything. I mean, we don't say why an electron is an electron. We just say this is what an electron is, this is what it does, but we can't explain why an electron is the way it is. And so essentially that's what Searle was saying. We can't explain, he would say, why the brain, how the brain produces consciousness, but it just does. Just like an electron produces charge. We don't know how or why, it just does. And that's the end of his explanation. He has reached the end of his categories, and this is it. We're done with all explanation. We are done, period. Conrad-Martius is not satisfied. And this is what makes her a metaphysician. She wants to go deeper. And now we can go into all sorts of problems that Gordon's bringing up. You know, what is she doing? You know, where is she going? She's a wide open field. And that's right. But that's what she's doing. She's trying to create this complex, in my mind, complex logical structure that sort of somehow or other explains or accounts for everything, just like string theory does or anything like that, which again is another wild imaginative project. So it's really not much different from string theory in my mind, or any theory of everything.
Well, there's this wild imaginative project called mathematics, you know, and maybe we could think of it as like Platonism, right? But I mean, all of mathematics is dealing with, for instance, the idea of number, you know, and the operations that happen with number as a kind of outside the framework causal category, maybe acausal category, maybe teleological category, that is not found in the world and cannot be verified through any kind of empirical evidence. We have to use some kind of, a different kind of inference. So there's logic and there's mathematics, and these things involve categories that are different from the empirical. And when we say, like, that guy in the Matrix that, I just want to eat my steak and I don't care whether we're in the Matrix, or when Searle says, like, well, I'm a physicalist and I'm satisfied with the brain does it. Certainly the brain does things, and the body does things and things happen. And whether it just depends on where we're satisfied. We have to deal with the fact that there's this higher degree of certainty in the categories of mathematics that's more apodictic in a way, and then even more apodictic when we have something like phenomenology or Platonic, Kantian, one of these kinds of philosophies dealing with like a transcendental ego, or the Cartesian idea that, or maybe Fichtean, idea of the self as being something that has a different category of evidence. Phenomenology is all about evidence, but it's coming out of mathematics. And we'll recall the Prolegomena, it's about this problem of the one and the many as Mannigfaltlichkeit's Lehre.
Well, listen, I really want to disagree at the following juncture of your presentation. When you characterize mathematics in a particular way, and then you analogized phenomenology to it as if it were in the same domain of human activity, but even more abstracted or complicated. I don't think that's true at all.
I find
and let me just give a quick example and then mute myself again. No philosopher ever anywhere did what Wiles did on the way to resolving for all mathematicians and for all time the case about Fermat's last theorem. He proved it. And no mathematician in history going forward is going to be able to disagree. That is so coercive, so objective, so punishing of dissent, that to me, it's outrageous to say, oh, and phenomenology is like that, but more so. No philosophy is anywhere near like that. This wasn't logic part of philosophy. Totally different question. That's the turf question. So so anyway, I'm out of it again.
That's pretty much what I wanted to say too. Because, well, I'm sorry. Maybe Evan wants to say something. Go ahead.
No. I'm just the voice of our dear friend Olga is screaming in my ear right now for us to locate the text somewhere to get back to the text there. And I'm not sure how helpful this is, but on 128, we seem to be, although that seems to have brought us out of this, but at least throw up the second paragraph there of 128. In an effort to interpret vital phenomena, two types of causality are inevitably employed: mechanical causality and the final conscious causality of a builder realizing a plan. The reason why these two forms appear so self-evident and immediately intelligible is because the adequacy of cause to effect is straightaway visible in both cases. And perhaps that passage can kind of help us to dive a little bit directly from the text into what is phenomenology doing? What are these categories doing? I just want to offer that up to the group if it's helpful.
Right, and I thank you. And I think that gets me back to my earlier point and supports it, that what Conrad-Martius is all about is understanding and saying as much as she can about that second form of causality, a builder operating according to a plan. That is her life work, to explain the world as it appears for someone who thinks it must be the case that I have to work at the level of a builder or a maker operating according to a plan, which is exactly teleology. That's the plan. And that is exactly what natural science, as a matter of convention, will not afford itself the privilege of accepting. But that doesn't mean the natural scientists can't be religious. They certainly can. They certainly can have in some moments of their lives a deep appreciation of I'm going to use the word because I don't want to circumrepute, of God. Because if that isn't what we're talking about here, you say, no, it's not just God. No, I think it's not just a demiurge. It's not a trivialized causality. It's that which lies behind and is the creative force for everything. And again, I was so grateful to hear Evan mention the Greek Orthodox approach, because there I think that is spelled out beautifully. David Bentley Hart does it. Others do it. And anyway, thank you for that.
I'd really like to piggyback on that, especially because I often, Randy, when I hear you talking about, for example, math or science, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I feel I'm hearing a confusion. And the confusion, and I think Gordon is saying something like this, the confusion I think I'm hearing is as if, like I think Gordon just put it, there are these different ways of approaching, and then we have phenomenology and philosophy. No, philosophy is unique, and it's very close to religion, and maybe can be in some, that's a question of interpretation, because we're talking about being as being. We're talking about the totality. The issue is presented to us. How does it all fit together? And what is reality? What are the fundamental categories that cover everything? What are they essentially? How do they relate to each other? How do they relate to the totality? Science does not do that. Mathematics does not do that. That is specifically what philosophy is. And that makes philosophy fundamentally different. And whether that project can be carried out or not is a great question. I think it can. But and this is partly responding to Gordon, well, what is the kind of evidence that there may be for trying to answer this unique question of everything and how everything fits together? I think there is, but that's obviously highly debatable. And I think it's not the same kind of evidence that you find in specific fields. And that's what Conrad-Martius is doing. It's not science. And that's one reason I really balk when I hear physicists talk about the theory of everything. Everything is not a category of physical science. The physical is a particular category. Yeah, unless you equate the physical with everything, which itself presupposes that you have the category of everything, which is not identical with the physical, and then you identify the two. That's what I want to say.
Certainly, I think placing some things that you had just said there into the text, if we just continue on with 128, she has the second paragraph beginning with the notorious final causality. I'll just pause for a second to give you guys a chance to.
Yeah, why don't I share
please,
it?
Please, Randy.
This is page 128, right? Let me just bring it up. And where are we?
So we are in 128, second full paragraph beyond the quote. We started this part, but she really gets into it kind of middle there, right after the parenthetical plan or intention. The notorious final causality in biology has been rejected justly by Dreich if it intended to say that the end, the future form of the organism, exercises an actual causal role. In the case of the builder, the plan, as the present ideal form or the future goal, has continuous and adequate causality. The decisive conceptual problem for developing the notion of entelechy is how the organism can contain a pre-project of itself as a direction-giving causal factor. This is a problem of the objectively meaningful or purposeful discussed earlier, and which we will soon return. And I think that is, I think that says something to where Conrad-Martius is going with this other way, this phenomenological or this categorical move towards entelechy, which she is distinctly bracketing away, as we've been noticing, from a purely materialistic view, at least as I'm reading it. I would love to hear how you guys process that, or y'all, sorry, gender neutral.
Well, you know, it's not completely clear to me what mechanical causality is. You know, what I naively think is it means a mindless causality. But as we know, later in this chapter, she's going to introduce the notion that, in my understanding, mechanical causality is itself as a form of entelechy, whatever the word is. Because, I mean, it has, I mean, in fact, physicists talk this way all the time. They talk about things desiring to go places, and they have, you know, it wants, they really use these terms all the time, that wanting to go to the lowest energy levels and things like that. I mean, maybe physicists need to reevaluate their vocabulary, but the very notion of potential is this notion of willfulness. I mean, anyway, the point, I'm not sure what she means by mechanical versus the final cause. Does anyone understand that, Randy?
I mean, it's, well, so take it that it's different, right?
Yeah, it's different.
Mechanical, going on, you know, early modern philosophy is tied to the interactions of bodies. So if we think of bodies like, say, billiard balls, right? They can roll around in, you know, in a valley, and they could want to go away from the periphery because it's a valley, and smack into each other. But if there's some kind of particles that are finer than billiard balls, then things change. And if there's like you know, a totally different like quantum realm, then there are different rules. And then if there's something that's not physical, but isn't just like metaphorical or some totally other category, but is like finer than the quantum, maybe like mathematics, you know, then we have totally different rules again, where it's you know, it's even, you can go finer. We're going into like a realm outside of the normal realm of billiard balls, you know, of mechanical interactions, maybe with like an electromagnetic, you know, covering so that we can't walk through walls or something. But, you know, there's a way that that we experience things happening in our billiard ball universe. And then there's different forms of entelechy. And maybe when she's saying entelechy, just like when we say science, we don't mean knowing, which includes like spiritual science and stuff, but natural science. When she says entelechy, she is using it in these specific contexts. So maybe she's borrowing from Driesch, for instance, and this whole discussion in philosophical biology, but she's also pulling it from Aristotle, where it does bear on the idea of like an atomistic interaction of, well, atoms, and then still not yet bodies in the sense of modern physics. So, I mean, I think when we contextualize all the ideas that are being juggled when we do philosophy, we start placing them in their proper places, and everything sets up a big system where all of these different schemas often will overlap and sometimes will be very, very different, like the diagram, right? Like we often talk about maybe like natural science operates over here when we're doing more like natural science of a mathematical bent, it's over here or something, you know.
So Randy, if I'm understanding you correctly, it makes me look at this passage a little differently. I want to see if this is what you're going with, is if we understand mechanical in that way of sort of bodies abiding by rules. It seems like that moves into sort of deterministic language. And that does seem to play in the nuance here, because when she begins to speak of entelechy, or the conception is there, we find words like, this is the problem of the objectively meaningful or purposeful discussed earlier. So is she talking about this other realm, not the mechanical, as being the realm of sort of purpose, will, this final cause being sort of the why that provides meaning, purpose, intention, what's our term?
Finished.
Let's say this. Direction giving is a term she used. Yeah. Pre-project of itself. Pre-project. Yeah. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah,
Would you
like
say,
in
or?
Whitehead, you know, we don't want this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This is one of these metabasis eis allo genos. You know, when you say that like this object here is going to interact with this object in a certain way, you know, as bodies interact, they're also interacting in other ways that we don't consider when we just like, you know, like I'm actually a living substance. My hand is different than me, right? But it's part of me. And when I hit this thing, you know, notice I'm not, my hand isn't shooting across the room because I'm hitting it with a certain force. It's just, you know, so there's like a different kind of causality operating in these bodies because I'm a living thing, and I can decide to just be holding my hand here and take the force and not like fling off. You know, so there's one example of like everyday stuff we're familiar with, but we don't think that when we wear that particular garb of ideas of like early modern Newtonian bodies interacting stuff. Of course, we do naturally think these things. I'm not going to just bumble around. I'm not just some body, you know, I'm somebody, you know. So I think when Husserl uses this term, the garb of ideas in the Crisis, for instance, you know, he's very cognizant of this issue of the paradoxes of subjectivity that lurk behind the different fields of science, and he's looking at it in terms of his own Wissenschaftslehre idea of like very almost in a way Kantian. You know, he has his own transcendental aesthetic and in the analyses, but in the Crisis, this garb of ideas is he's not just critiquing Galileo and Copernicus and Newton and chucking it.
We could kind of pull this back to what's really at issue here, which is, I think she is trying to make a distinction between two kinds of causality. One, roughly speaking, one kind of causality is one billiard ball hitting another. Another kind of causality is the development of an organism. And I'm not sure what she means by it, but she says things like, so, and the former could be called mechanical, the second could be called entelechy. And so she says the mechanical is actual potentiality, but the entelechy is potential potentiality. I'm not sure what she means by that, but well, I think that's the issue. That's what's at issue here. What does she mean by mechanical? What does she mean by entelechy? And it's a question of the difference between the living and the non-living. Is that not what's at issue here? And I think he is trying to define that. Like Bill is saying, what is mechanical? And the physicists can't tell you. But when we say, well, she's trying to reach beyond that. She's trying to get beyond just the, you know, kinds of definitions you find in science to say, what is it really? Can she? That's what she's trying to do. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interrupted in that way, Jeremy. You're right. Just the distinction she does create here is again on 128. It's the mechanical causality and the final conscious causality. That is specifically her language.
But then there's another difference because not just specific conscious causality, she's also talking about unconscious causality of living things. What is the causality involved in the growth and functioning of an organism? And that is not conscious causality, but it's not mechanical causality either. And in a way, it's the main thing she's trying to gain some further insight into. You see what I'm saying?
I totally agree. I just wanted to bring it.
I wonder if I could, at the risk of making this even harder than it is.
Can't be.
Well, now this isn't making the content harder, but it means maybe the way we try to frame it. As I'm looking at, let's see, I'm not sure I've got the right page here. Yeah, I'm on 129. She says, or the Hart says, we want to begin with some brief general remarks on potency. And then there's this long paragraph about different forms of cause and the analysis of the word can. And the only thing I wanted to offer here, I'm not sure I understand where HCM leaves and Jim Hart starts here. And I've wondered about that on various occasions because he's a different mind from hers, with great respect for her, but there's a lot of him in this book, and he doesn't claim otherwise. It's not a translation of her book. It's Jim Hart's brilliant mind at work on another brilliant mind, the one of Conrad-Martius. And so I think we have the possible problem of anachronisms because he knows stuff that she couldn't have known. And he's just not her. So I'm just wanting to say that I'm not sure how important it is in this particular paragraph of when we're talking about her and when we're talking about him being about her.
And you know, having known him for, oh my God, 50 years. Oh my God, it's not 50. No, 40 years. 40 years. This is his dissertation. And,
right, exactly.
And he's a very creative thinker. Really, I can't believe I got to know this guy. And so I think what you're talking does happen. I think in his dissertation, I don't know. I see him more. My sense is this is probably there's more of, I don't see him as, I think, how should I put it? I guess I see him much more here really trying to explain it than put his own ideas into it. He wasn't quite sure what his own ideas were at this point. And in fact, the interesting, I don't know, one thing about his development is in this book, he's very interested in this kind of question. But then he moved into Heidegger and Husserl, and I think he became kind of leery about this metaphysical explanation. And it's almost like after many, many years, he's coming back and he's taking it more seriously again. Because he kind of, in his career, he did much more with theology and ethics and more like, you could say spirituality or consciousness. And he did this whole question of spirit in nature and the philosophy of nature is not something that Hart continued to pursue in his later work. And I find it quite interesting now, you know, when he's very much older, he is coming back to this and he has not forgotten about it. And he's still very engaged with these questions, but for what it's worth, it's something, I just wanted to.
Thank you.
I guess I could keep going on about this because
I wanted to get back to this distinction between the mechanical and the final cause, entelechy. So I'm still confused by it, and so I can imagine where they both can be the case. If for example, we were to follow salt ions in a water solution dissolved in water, and somehow or other the water be evaporated, then you would just follow the salt molecules around. They'd be bumping into each other and doing mechanical causality. But then all of a sudden, you would start to see that they would form themselves into this very distinctive crystal formation. and it would be a distinctive pattern that would replicate itself countless times, no matter how many times you did it. And so, but you wouldn't see that. It wouldn't be implicit in their mechanical behavior, but it's somehow or other written into their character, whatever you want to call it. And the same, we can say this about countless things. I mean, if you look at statistical mechanics and you follow atoms, things like that, they don't seem to have any ordered behavior. They may just be a little, almost like back to that's how they thought about them in the 1900s as billiard balls. But only the course of countless number of these things working together, somehow or other they produce electric currents and all sorts of things. And we could even say the human body. So the point is that both mechanical causality and this final cause seem to be at work together. But the question that Conrad-Martius might be asking is, where is this final causality? Why do we? And this is actually the question going all the way back to Aristotle about the notions of a soul. So why we need a soul to form this, to keep this form, the living form together. So anyway, that's the way I understand it. And so I wish, hope Conrad-Martius and Jim will clarify this for us. It's not clear to me what the real distinction between these are, except for the word that Evan points out, and that's the word conscious. Because in the soul crystal, we don't have to ever mention the word consciousness, even though we do get this final form.
It seems to me you've defined exactly the issue that she's most focused on, that there are things that happen even in physical nature that at least seem to be teleological, like the formation of crystals or like the formation of living bodies out of atoms. And how can we understand that happening? And she affirms that merely physical categories cannot explain the emergence of life. I think that's, and it seems to me that's what you're acknowledging, that there's at least a point there, that it's at least hard to see how merely physical categories can explain the emergence of life. Or am I misunderstanding what you just said?
No, I'm agreeing. I don't know what a physical category is.
Well, exactly, and that's what. And so she's talking about, and yet, to some extent, we can somehow understand what those things mean. When we try to define them, we get confused. But on some level, it's immediately obvious. Like she says, we immediately experience the difference between seeing a ball hit a bat and seeing a plant grow. We see that. What's going on there?
May I jump in? Because actually Hart has exactly what you're saying is a rather excellent flourish of this at the bottom of 128, giving an exact example. Let's see here, second paragraph. Well, I'll just read it. In mechanical causality, the adequacy of effect to cause is a matter of genuine insight. But to what extent do we really see in the thrown rock a proportionate cause for the broken window pane? We do, in fact, anticipatively grasp in the force or sting of the thrown rock or ball the possible movements of or impact upon other masses. And this anticipated grasp need not be purely psychologically interpreted as referring back to other familiar cases, and therefore an expectation of the same again, because that has always been our experience of this matter. I think she's really digging, our Hart at least is explicating exactly what you're saying, kind of in this bit right here, as I see, yeah.
So in what you just read, are we introducing a Humean analysis to the problem? Jeremy, you're muted.
I think what he's saying is that physical force is something that in some sense we do immediately experience. And we can see it in, somehow we inherently understand that a rock can do something to something else. even though the rock obviously isn't aiming at breaking the glass. And that we can immediately understand that that's somehow fundamentally different from a plant growing, for example. I think that's what, yeah, and there is some basis in experience for that. Those aren't just abstract categories that we impose on experience.
And not
so,
just,
yeah.
I'm sorry, not just a synthetic experience either. I think is what he's getting at there, because we recognize it, we anticipatively grasp it. So it's not like what's being said here is, I've seen rocks thrown through windows, therefore I affirm this rock can be thrown. It's anticipating that.
And that's exactly what I was trying to get at. And he's making the point. Another interpretation could be, well, we see it happening now, and that reminds us of it happened another time and another time before, so therefore we make an inference it's going to happen again. And he's saying, no, that doesn't really account for it. Somehow, in the very experience of the rock moving, we already have the anticipation. It's not something that can simply be explained by a habitual expectation. And I think that's true. I think it's true for what it's worth. And that there's a fundamental difference with life. Life it's a change, it's a motion, it's a development, but it's a different kind of causality. And then obviously we have to distinguish that from a conscious plan. So there's three levels: the physical, the living, and the spiritual. There you go. And that those are fundamental categories of reality that we know about, and that if we want to understand everything, we need to grasp and acknowledge and see how they relate to each other.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, maybe there are these three, and maybe there's like two in between, there's five, maybe there's a lot more. You know, I mean, I think I think we're all in agreement, right, with her as well, that there are more categories than we'll ever know. I mean, any of our systems of knowing, any of our sciences, you know, in their compartmentalized operation or in their overall operation, you know, are just offering different categories of explanation, and there's a multiplicity of them. It's not just physical, nor does the buck stop at life and life entelechy, you know, because there's like truth and error, you know, the spiritual, and so on. There's probably even more than that. I mean,
Yeah. Well, you know, that makes a lot of sense, and that brings us back to a phrase that was raised earlier in the conversation as if, and we don't want to go there. And that's the phrase or the term relativism. Because once you allow all these domains of knowing, domains of understanding, or understanding, how on earth could you judge between them? And why wouldn't you simply adopt a humility, modesty about our inability to judge between them and become, in some sense, a radical relativist? Because from a theological point of view, the option is to say, well, God played favorites. And the idea that God played favorites isn't really, well, I mean, I suppose for some people you say damn straight. But other than that, knowing that God played favorites, because I'm one of them, other than that, I don't know how you would avoid relativism, but it's no longer a pejorative term. It's just the way things are. It seems to me, Randy, that follows from the line you were taking, and I'm inclined to favor it.
What do you mean by God played favorites?
Well, if only that when you consider, I mean, Randy was developing the idea that there are many, many domains of discourse, ways of living in discourses, etc., ways of being, forms of life, domains of meaning, and so on. uh, and the question was, well, how to choose between them if I must? And the answer was, well, why do you have to?
Well, do you
Uh,
think God played favorites or not?
Oh, me? Do I think God played?
Yeah,
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
you
What do you
don't.
mean? Are you saying like, I mean, first of all, like the contemporary theological, like the really shallow stuff, like that is not what's going on here.
Oh,
I
well,
mean, you mean
I'm
like
with
best of all
you.
possible worlds thing?
What I mean is for I'm I thought I was parroting you when you described going beyond science, mathematics, phenomenology, and you said there may be others. You were talking about 2 or 3 ways. Maybe there's 4 or 5 or 8 or an indefinitely large number. What was the unit of discourse where
Well,
you were
like
saying,
okay, I mean, like take the doctrine of method in Kant. He doesn't fill it all out. He says this is a big project. He wants to like do this Tower of Babel thing, you know, with but he does build like this transcendental aesthetic, and you know he projects these categories, but he doesn't fill it out. Husserl is ever a beginner, right? It's an endless task of phenomenology. But he does build this method. Similar, Conrad-Martius has this real ontological method and doesn't fill it out. I'm just saying there's
well,
all these
and
categories that aren't filled out. But
well,
science, mathematics, these are fundamental to any possible category. That's
well,
like their function.
okay, but consider this when you were talking about Husserl, the perpetual beginner, which I agree with. Well, if there is a classic text in Zen Buddhism, it is beginner's mind. The nature of Zen Buddhism is precisely about always being the beginner.
And I should wonder if that causes us a recourse towards meaning not being derived from the domain, but by the operations of the conscious agent, such that whatever domain in which we enter, it is not that from which we derive meaning, but through the conversation about categories. Although that doesn't jive with Martius, and I totally recognize that. Her attempt is to create a sort of category of final intelligible consciousness. So I'm disagreeing with Martius as I understand, Conrad-Martius as I understand when I say that. But I do not think a multiplicity or even an infinite multiplicity of domains necessarily causes a recourse to relativism. I think we can have a world of infinite wonder beyond what any one person could possibly intellect or understand, and see that as kind of a givenness of God or a givenness of the universe, however you wish, because we have the operations to form intelligibility.
Yeah, I think what you said is perfectly beautiful, and I sign on to it 100%. Now, so having had that moment of ecstasy, we have to follow the rule. What follows ecstasy? You got to do the laundry. And so after the ecstasy, the laundry. And so then the question is, what does that mean? Everydayness, living your life, making choices, when we understand this extraordinary multiplicity, which in our moments of ecstasy we can bathe in and find glory in, find God in. That's exactly where. But then the phone rings, or you got to go to the bathroom, or whatever it is, and embodiment comes back and bites us in the butt.
It seems to me you're introducing a fundamental category of reality, of being bit in the butt. That's a category of being. That is the category of being.
I'm with you. I'm with you. What would you accept this? That reality is what the world presents to awareness.
But also more. That's my point.
Well, yeah, but can we go that far at least?
Well, and I think the theologian in me has to drop in for a second to say it's a fundamentally powerful thing of incarnational theology that God in Christ shat. You know,
What was that last word?
God in Christ defecated. Sorry, I was being overly.
I thought that's what you said. You certainly
yeah.
couldn't have been saying that.
Okay. No. That is the entirety of incarnational theology, and its most basic and fundamental is that God got bit in the butt. You know, so I think there's recourse there, but I'm not sure how
that to me is
that
really
is to our current conversation.
I don't know, but I think that's the most important thing I've heard. You know, I love it. Further deponent saith not. I'm not clicking this thing back on except to say goodbye.
I'm a little lost. I mean, we're talking about this section, causality and potency. You know, but we're importing really big discussions.
Well, I think there are some fundamental issues going on, which are, I don't think Conrad-Martius would go, I'm not really sure. And you've actually studied her much more than any of us. So I speak under correction, but I'm not sure that Conrad-Martius would go along with the way you, Randy, seemed to be talking a minute ago, that, well, there's this way of looking reality and there's another and another and another and another. I don't see her talking that way. I see, and I, you know, again, I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that she really is trying to carry out the fundamental project of philosophy, going back to Plato and Aristotle, namely, starting with the being as such, which isn't even a category, or everything, and to say, well, what are the fundamental dimensions or categories of everything and how they do, and that she thinks she can discover them and define them. And it's not like they're just more and more and more. And I don't see her as being relativistic either.
I don't understand the connection between relativism, which I understand is like what Husserl is critiquing, like in First Philosophy all the time with his version of First Philosophy. I don't see how relativism is connected to what I'm suggesting.
Well, yeah, well, I think Gordon may have misunderstood a little what you were saying, because I don't think you were saying, well, there are just lots and lots and lots of different ways that we can understand the universe, and people are always going to be coming up with more, and so there's really no way to understand or decide between them. Yeah, I don't think you're not saying that. Rather, you are saying there are, which I think Conrad-Martius is saying, there are, I don't know the right word, call it dimensions. There are dimensions of reality, and she attempts to define them. And there are a finite number of dimensions of reality that she thinks she can identify. And you've got that chart. And is that incorrect?
I mean, there's a finite number of dimensions, like for this reality.
Well, like for example, you know, there's the physical, there's the spiritual, and I don't know if she deals with issues like this. There's the physical.
Yeah, I guess, you know, there's different ways of chopping it up, and there's different kinds of presentations, like a plant.
Well, here, that's a good question.
It can be chopped up in different ways as well.
Would she accept that kind of metaphor? Would she accept, we hear it a lot. Husserl would never talk in those terms. There are different ways of chopping it up. No, there's structures of transcendental subjectivity, which he believes you can discover and precisely define. We're not free to chop it up as we please. There are not different ways. He believes he's nailed it. And
yeah, well, I mean, look,
for example, yeah, I'm sorry,
well,
go ahead.
Okay, so there's like I don't mean that you can chop it up and there's all these different ways. I mean, like in a certain sense I do, okay, but it's not like, I feel like there's a disconnect here. Like, yes, there are absolute structures, like, and they're like kind of structuralist structures, like the transcendental ego. It's not a thing, I don't mean structure like that, but it's the foundation of any system of orientation of a manifold.
Right.
It's like the center point of any manifold, and the manifold could be laid out for like, a presentation of givens to stick into like sets and, so the life world, but it could also be like a field of study, and the various fields of study put together as a system of knowing, a Wissenschaftslehre. I mean, it's just like the presentation of one and many has certain transcendental structures. Like this is Husserlian, it's a continuation of that project. And I'm just saying that I'm often thinking in terms of like putting putting Conrad-Martius and Timonetska, for instance, together, and like Fink and Husserl later on are working on this. Well, Fink is working on this constructive phenomenology. Timonetska's is called contextual phenomenology. All of these are about bringing the Husserlian project into like bigger and bigger consequences, or shedding more and more light on bigger and bigger categories. Like for Timonetska, it's about possible worlds, not just in like the Everett interpretation of quantum theory sense, and not just in the semantic sense of like possible universes of discourse, but in a much bigger sense. She's actually tying it to the idea of dimensionality and what she calls the world order, and it being in a system of world orders. This is called the Great Chain of Being, and she talks about this like Analecta Husserliana 11 is that's the title of it, the Great Chain of Being. And then people like Lovejoy.
So she has in some ways project, some ways similar to to Conrad-Martius.
Yeah, I mean,
clearly they're not just saying
totally
the same thing.
Well, I mean, I think that they're not, okay, but they're kind of moving in the same direction, you could say, like in a sort of they don't use this word, but it's really like a kind of theosophical direction. It's not a theological necessarily. And I take a lot of issue. I look very carefully, I listen very carefully when people are characterizing Conrad-Martius's work as so theological. Like those are categories that there are categories that are maybe considered by the history of tradition, as theological, but they're not just
so
theological.
How do you define the difference between theological and theosophical?
Well, I mean, so theological, is like these these are just terms that come from the history, like Rosmini, right? He has this whole sense of theosophy that's not at all connected to
that's not theosophy at all.
Well, that's the title of one of his books, for instance.
But
what he means.
Yeah, but what he means is completely different from what the word came to be. So it's theology, and it's his understanding of the relationship of philosophy.
Yeah, but he's doing metaphysics. It's not about like there's a God, like yes, there is, like for him, and for a lot of these people, but that doesn't mean it's really, we have to be really careful, because these are really heavy words, and people think that suddenly they understand where someone's coming from.
Exactly.
When they're doing metaphysics, they're doing ontology, they're doing Aristotle and Kant and Husserl, and they're not like just following their Baptist. She was like a part of this tradition. Sure, she like was a Baptist. Paul Ricoeur was a Protestant, and these are more. He's more of a theologian than someone like Conrad-Martius. She's a metaphysician.
Yeah, I think part of the problem culturally today is there's such a heavy, enormous level of prejudice against religion and academia. And
right, like Timonetska made an editorial point to make people change any of their essays in the Analecta Husserliana if they started using God rhetoric, theological
why did she
rhetoric.
do that? Why did she do that?
Because it's metaphysics.
So people are not allowed to talk about their religious point of view?
No, they are allowed, of course, and there's plenty of that in the Analecta Husserliana, but the point is we have to be careful, because we don't want to make it, yeah, like David said, her closeness to Catholicism, right? You Google her.
I guess I want to make a point of this. We have to be careful because of the heavy, irrational, negative bigotry against religious belief in academia. And we do have to be careful about that. That's a cultural, sociological
what's
reality.
really important
It's
is to
not an
protect
intellectual
metaphysics.
reality. It's not an intellectual reality. It's
My dear
not
friends,
an
Could be.
intellectual issue.
my dear friends. I think just two things come to my mind. It does seem like to gain some productivity within this conversation, if we wish to continue it, maybe some dialogue about the difference between metaphysics and theology.
Exactly. Exactly.
But also, I'm just very interested to return to the text.
Yeah.
Apparently, I'm that guy.
Good job. Thank you.
Particularly when we talk about this multiplicity of domains, something that strikes me that is quite, I think Gordon intuited this by his recourse back to sort of more, not surface in a negative way, but in a way of recognizing a sort of telescopic knowledge, nature to these things, that Conrad-Martius is, or at least in Hart's interpretation, paying attention to things in and of themselves, the classic understanding from Husserl. There's something about the fact that we can return to a rock and a window. And we can see in that this distinction she's drawn between the mechanistic cause and a final cause. That we can see, yes, a rock can be thrown through a window, and I can recognize that as part of its final or essential nature that doesn't just exist within its mechanical being. So perhaps that's the way forward is that it's not, I don't see her going for buck wild every domain. I see her as paying attention to things in of themselves and coming up with domains of knowledge or causes or causal relationships that make sense within that. I don't know if you agree or disagree within the text. Fortunately, I had to switch to my Kindle, so I can't even look at the text right now. It's been this day.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I think came up earlier. There's you could look at, in a way, a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. The top-down is starting with nous and God and the one.
So that's what I mean by theosophy.
Or the bottom-up is exactly what Evan just said. We can look at phenomena and focus on them and absorb them and honestly see what is really in the thing itself. And we can notice distinctions exactly like what you just made. We can see something about a rock that really looks like it has power. And you know what? We can feel it sometimes. We experience physical forces hurting us. Or we can see a plant growing. And I think what they will say is, this is not a matter of importing some intellectual categories. It grows out of concrete, sensitive, perceptive experience. I mean, this is what people like the Romantic poets were trying to do. This is what Wordsworth is trying to do in his response to nature, for example. So there are a lot of things going on. There are metaphysical questions, there are religious traditions, there's also concrete human experience. And all of them need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, so we are running low on time here. I think that this discussion that we've had sort of around physics, is actually naturally going towards the plan that we made, that we would go into these like 4.7 on page 157, the basic structures of nature's self-formation, and then the anthropological stuff, like the next section, the natural formation of the spirit soul of man. So I think that we're actually moving on a fine track for that. I think the way Hart has these different topics interspersed, like here's the ontological dynamic, and then here's a section on physics. I don't think it like is so haphazard, like jumping around. I think that there is like a real continuity both in Hart's presentation and in Conrad-Martius's thought. She's incorporating it's not just about particular sciences like physics versus biology, or bringing categories of entelechy from biology into physics, or that's not the only thing that's happening here, but rather she has a holistic metaphysical perspective, and then we'll get presentations of that parsed out into these sections from Hart's research when he was writing his dissertation, covering all of her work. The physics and the metaphysics in like the books on time, space, and being, and then the like Selbstaufbau der Natur type stuff, more about like biology. And then there's like all these papers she's written on theology, so there's a lot there. These are all over the the map of knowledge domains. And what she's doing all along, of course, remember, right, is ontology, specifically this kind of originally Husserlian real ontology. And she's continuing, she's doing metaphysics. She's continuing the project of philosophy. We'll call it philosophy, right? First philosophy. When I said theosophy, that's sort of what I mean. Like Aristotle calls his metaphysics really theology. In fact, at times in the metaphysics, that's what he's referring to, of course, the theology of the unmoved mover. But guess what? That's right back here with us in the aeonic world periphery. So it's like kind of Conrad-Martius's version of this, and we're going to go into that. When we go into these sections, it starts by talking about that.
And I actually think, at least for me, and I hope for others, this has been kind of helpful. And, I've been perhaps a little critical, Randy, of some things you've been saying, because at least sometimes sounds to me like I don't think you're making the distinction between philosophy and everything else. Maybe I'm wrong. But in any case, what's going on is it's not like science is not her concern. What I think what she's trying to do is, from the perspective of the whole, from the perspective of metaphysics,
right,
how are we to understand the meaning of science? And how are we to understand the meaning of biology and the meaning of the mechanical or the physical and the spiritual? And what is important and different about her is the extent to which she does dig into the details of scientific questions. But and I guess what I want to keep emphasizing is, I think she does distinguish between what she's doing and science itself. It's more how to understand what the physical means in the context of the whole of reality.
Yeah. Jeremy, I'm so glad you said that, because I wanted just in our concluding moments to note, pretty much piggybacking exactly off what you said, the only ache I really feel is something that I think is going to lead us forward, so it's fine that it wasn't as just, is how do we appreciate this experience of the phenomena of meaning? Because that seems to be a strong term, or that whole nexus of ideas seems to be strong in her conversation of the difference between sort of final cause and mechanical cause. I think we'll probably get into that as we look at the sort of construction of the spirit soul. But I'm glad that you kind of tie in a little bit to that at the end there. Yeah.
That is an excellent note to end on, a meditation on meaning. Very good. Yeah, no, I fully agree. Like, sometimes this cosmos noetos term in her philosophy is translated as the Zen Cosmos, the finest layer that's shared by every mechanical physics, biology, psychology, and in the contemporary and in the ancient really weird sense. These all participate in structures of meaning, and philosophy. First philosophy is all about this stuff, and it's not just linguistic meaning.
And the other side of it, of course, is, okay, suppose we are asking questions like with Aristotle, what is being as being, or what is the totality? What are we doing there? What's the right word for it? Is it metaphysics? Is it philosophy? Is it ontology? Is it theosophy? Is it theology? Is it revelation? Is it grace? Is it, well, there are huge questions there as well. And I think she also has something to say about that.
Is it pneumatosophy? Is it psychosophy?
I like creating new words. Let's do it, man. Right on.
Well, so psychosophy comes from Charles Wolff, who was coming up with all kinds of cool words. Lambert around the same time gives us phenomenology before Kant, you know, and then anyway, these words get charged with certain contextual meanings, but returning to the essence of the words and what they mean is really helpful as we consider meaning in the physical and lived sense, which is what she's talking about. So, you know, meaning and reality are these ultimately spiritual categories, and not just in your usual, not your mama's spirituality, you know.
Unless your mama is Hedwig Conrad-Martius.
Unless that.
I'm sorry. I must scoot, my friends. Thank you. When are we meeting next? Has that been
The 27th.
27th? Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
And we'll be talking about, as we outlined, you know, 4-7 and on to the end of the chapter.
All right. See you then.
Evan.
Bye.